Hi everyone, good night. Welcome to the last Pint of Science Netherlands online event of this year. It's episode 10, and tonight we're gonna go a little bit off what we usually talk and go to political sciences and talk a little bit how the United States, the scenario there, and how they affect the whole world in a sense. And for that, we're going to have a very special guest.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting tonight. So we're your hosts. My name is Hannah, and on this side we have
Guilherme.
And so tonight we have a political scientist, so a little bit different from the usual scientist that you would probably think of. And her name is Roberta Haar from Maastricht University. So we will invite her into the room right now.
Hello.
And welcome, Roberta. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me for this evening.
Yes, I think it's a great way to round off these Pint of Science talks, and it really goes to show what we try to do in Pint of Science, where it's not just about biology, but we want to get people from, chemistry, but physics and astronomy and all different ways to go. So I think political science is a great way to go. So maybe you could first give a little bit of an introduction about yourself and even what a political scientist is and how you got into that. Then that would be really great for the audience, I reckon.
Yes, thank you. Well, we started out talking about my own background in science, and then I started out in my undergraduate years as a biology major because I very much like bugs in particular and biology in particular. But I would have to say I'm a true liberal arts, because I'm working at the liberal arts part of Maastricht University College Maastricht, because I also very much like poetry and writing, and a big part of what I do is writing. So the combination of writing and poetry and science and political science, I think, makes me really a true liberal arts person more than in any one thing in particular. But over the years, you sort of narrow yourself. In my narrowing, I became interested in international relations, and then with international relations, foreign policy, and then transatlantic relations in particular. So that's what I'm doing now, is looking mostly at transatlantic relations and trying to, in the Dutch audience, maybe explain to them the peculiarities or the uniqueness about America. And I'm writing now, I don't know if you noticed that I'm writing a column for Elsevier Weekblad about once a month called Across the Atlantic, where I'm trying to indeed explain to a Dutch audience things about all things America, mostly about foreign policy.
Yes, I did read a couple of those articles and they helped me to understand a bit. So very, very great. So maybe you would, definitely. So maybe you'd like to go into a little bit your talk and explain what you're going to be discussing with us tonight, and giving us a bit of.
If I may interject, let's also cheer.
Oh yes, of course. First,
Pint of Science after all.
Pint of Science. Cheers, everyone. And audience, don't forget that you can write comments and questions that we can ask to Roberta as well. If you have anything you'd like to add to what she's saying, or any burning questions that you'd like to ask.
Yes, interject. I did prepare a PowerPoint. I do have some things, but do interject if you have questions along the way. So should we start?
Yeah, let's bring the PowerPoint up.
Okay. Well, what I want to do today is maybe a subtitle of this talk could be, is the Trump phenomenon a symptom or a cause in shifts in American foreign policy? We could talk about that. And in this lecture, I want to talk about 3 different shifts. Maybe we could go to the first slide then. The first, yeah, okay. So I want to talk about 3 shifts, and those are a declining support in general for international organizations, including NATO, WTO, all sorts of international organizations. I think we see that in the part of the United States. The second thing is that we see an escalation of what has been termed since the 1970s as the burden sharing debate. And I'll explain a bit more later in the lecture what that is about, but it's basically about Europeans sharing in the costs of their own security and defense, because of course the US is taking the lion's share of that, and this has been a debate since the 1970s, but we see a shift in the fact that it's escalated recently. And the last shift that I want to talk about is a return to realpolitik, and I will give you some cases, some instances of that. And then if I give you the rest of the outline, what I want to talk about in this lecture is that I want to link these shifts and the symptom and a cause of these shifts to why Americans chose Trump in 2016, and maybe also link that to why 73 million also voted for him in 2020. And then think about what sort of impact he's had on U.S. foreign policy. And then that's sort of the stock taking that we can have for this lecture. I want to move then forward to look ahead and think about what a Joe Biden presidency would look at over the horizon, which is the most important security foreign policy issues on the horizon. Okay, so shall we start with the next slide then? So the first shift, so I have this lovely little photo that maybe you are aware of, but the first shift that I want to point out to is the U.S. retreating from its global leadership role, its support of the international system that it put in place after the Second World War, and you add to this its retreat from U.S. foreign policy, that it's become generally more circumspect in how it handles itself on the world stage. And this is already true under the president before, under Barack Obama. But certainly with Trump and his America First approach, you see that the U.S. is no longer thinking about grand strategy or long-term commitments, but really thinking about specific challenges confronting the U.S. Trump's transactional foreign policy really adds to this. His transactional foreign policy often appeared to be driven for personal gain. He often had a zero-sum view of the world. Also, this played out for him primarily in economic competition on the world stage. So we could say that his own worldview, if we could say he has a worldview of any sort, distinctly did not support the traditional role of the U.S. supporting international organizations. Now, this system or this decline has been in evidence for some time. We could say that it's also part of the whole of Western values being challenged. We could say that Brexit is also part of this. Why the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union. We could say that in general there is a loss of faith in international organizations, like the EU, not only in UK, but also here in continental Europe. There is a loss of faith in international organizations. They maybe are too broad, too intrusive, maybe ineffective. So, but if we say that Trump is symptomatic of this large revision, then we can say that it doesn't matter if he was in the White House, but the fact that he was in the White House, we can say unmistakably hastened, I would say, America's distancing from international organizations, including NATO. Okay, let's talk about the next shift. And the next slide, please. The next slide is this, as I mentioned before, the escalation of the burden sharing debate. So that's clear to everybody what that is, right?
Yeah, so that's, as you mentioned, that's as you mentioned, the kind of the big, burden that America took on to help protect Europe, which I also read about in your articles.
Maybe burden is a bad word for this.
Yeah,
that's how it's been called since the 1970s. But it really has to do with, who is helping finance European defense, and what we see now in this change under Trump, we see that there's an escalation in the condemnation of Europeans that they're not doing more for their own defense. But every president, including Obama, asked the Europeans to contribute more for their own defense. Obama and his first Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, even said if the Europeans don't contribute more, they risked collective military irrelevance. So they have to bear more of the burden. And you could even say the fact that there's something unfair about the burdens or the costs of financing this is partly why Trump won an election in 2016, because he capitalized on the fact that Americans didn't like the fact that Europeans are not paying for more of their own defense. So there's more dwindling support for allies. But what's different about what Trump is doing to all these other presidents and Gates and things like that, Secretary of Defense is pointing out, is Trump is very much emphasizing the purely quantitative elements of alliances without any appreciation of the qualitative aspect of alliances. Trump does not include the benefits of having allies. And you can see this is when he was in the new NATO headquarters, and he opened it up in May 2017, where he addressed Europeans there. You see the European leaders looking there very uncomfortable. So when he's really pointing these things out, you can see that they are shaken, sort of escalating the whole type of debate. And I think that really had some destructive effects on America's standing and its global interests.
Well, if I can
that's the second point. Yes.
If I can also, because it's true when you think about this, this America shifting away from this wanting to share the burden, as we call it, you do really think of the Trump era. But as you said, it actually started before. So then can I ask, because it's not something that I would really think of or remember what the conversations were like then, what was Europe's reaction when, for instance, the Obama administration was saying such like this? It was clearly done in a less aggressive way. So was it?
It all starts out when Europe recovers after the war economically and now becomes a competitor to the United States economically. And so it's felt like, okay, you were recovered, now you can bear more of the burdens. But then this is also very unpopular in publics within Europe. So leaders have to also make it clear to publics why they should bear more of the burden for their own defense. And I would have to say that the other part of it is America can be a little bit schizophrenic about this. So they want Europeans to bear more of the burdens. And certainly Trump's view was, okay, it means that Europeans just have to buy weapons from America off the shelf. That's what he wanted. That was his view of the quantitative again. But but America also said, okay, well, they didn't like it when maybe Europeans were also challenging it. They wanted Europeans to be a little bit on the smaller brother aspect of this regard. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy in it. But nevertheless, it is very hard for European leaders to also sell increased defense spending to their publics. But I will talk about maybe towards the end, because I do think that is changing. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to speak about the return of realpolitik. Now, this is the third piece of evidence that U.S. foreign policy is shifting, and it relates to the return of power politics in the world. It's prompting the reappearance of the sovereign state as the most important actor on the world stage. And again, this is something that predates Trump. It emerged with Russian adventurism in the East, in his Back to the Future world. In this Back to the Future world, 2014 really is a watershed year, because this is the year that Russia seizes Crimea, the year that Russia destabilizes the eastern region of Ukraine, the Donbass region. It also is the year that Russian forces within the eastern part of Ukraine shoot down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. And of course, that's a very important event for here in the Netherlands. And it is also the rise of this Islamic State group in the Middle East. You see all these things that look like there are deep structural changes that are indeed, I would say, more important in understanding transatlantic relations than any one president sitting in America. However, it is true that Trump then complicates these things a bit further. Now, if realists are right, and we have this Back to the Future realpolitik, then security-seeking explanations and states wanting to sort of think about their own interests first, these are, you would say, they're exerting centrifugal forces. Now, there's a big sciencey word. They're exerting forces that are breaking apart alliances like the EU, like NATO, and realists would say these things have lifespans. And if you're thinking about this, if you're thinking about all these changes happening in the structure of international relations, then you would say that Americans and the Electoral College voted for Trump because many felt he was the leader that best met this sort of realpolitik of the 2010s and beyond. Now, this is true, and realists are right. Europeans have to get busy, because if you're thinking about a proper defense, you're paying for your own defense. This is expensive. This means projecting power. This means projecting deterrence. And in May last year, a think tank in London called the IISS, or the International Institute for Strategic Studies, it estimated that to defend Eastern Europe, just Eastern Europe, without involving the US, European NATO members would need to spend nearly 400 billion or 3.5 billion. And that's just that part. And they also thought that closing the current military gap would take 15 to 20 years. So you're talking about a significant investment that Europeans would have to make if they had to defend just the eastern part of the continent. So because Trump has questioned NATO, it's problematic for Europe and its security and defense, obviously. But maybe it's good because the underlying logic of the alliance has now, I would say, prompted Europeans to boost their defense spending. And in fact, more NATO members are hitting the target that was made in the Wales summit in 2014, the NATO Wales summit, that there the NATO members agreed that they would have 2% of their GDP and that they would meet that target by 2024. And now we have many more countries that are actually doing that. 9 met it last year. I'm not sure how many this year, but NATO members are actually increasing their spending.
And
so
if I may have a question, do you think that all of this shift also changes how the public sees the investment on defense? Because as I said before, it's something that if there is somebody to defend, they don't want their own government spending money that could be for schools, for example, going to the defense. Could we say there was a shift overall on how the public sees this type of spending, and also maybe even being afraid of the United States?
Well, there's certainly a shift at, let's say, at the EU level. And in fact, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has talked about building a genuine European defense union. And here, the idea is to take money that's already there, some of it earmarked for EU industry. So you have the French Commissioner of the Single Market, Thierry Breton, the idea is then to take this money and maybe put it into space industry. There's now 14.4 billion in a European defense fund. And the idea is then to use this money in ways that complement US defense research, sort of try to maybe think about dual use components and how you do this research and development. So it doesn't have to be, let's say, investing in tanks or aircraft carriers, which aren't really good for fighting the wars of tomorrow anyway, but investing it into research and development that might create jobs, that might do things that are much more rewarding and have things that are better for overall society. So not just don't think about investing in defense in a very traditional way, but think about it in an innovative way, think about it in a complementing way, think about space, think about cyber, think about artificial intelligence. These sorts of things are still spending for defense, but maybe not in the way that publics are normally thinking about it.
And so it's it's not so much about.
Sorry,
it's also not so much about, okay, America are going to reduce the spending, so we'll take that over and do the same things. But it's about, okay, America is spending this, we're going to bring it up and also provide this ourselves. It's about, like you said, being complementary instead of just direct. Oh, they're going to let this go to the wayside, so we have to now do that.
Or finding niche things, finding ways that you can. And thinking about the future threats, which could be hypersonic, which could be cyber, could think about, or drone warfare. Think about future threats and not thinking about sort of things that are of the past. Yeah. So I'd like to switch. So we have these 3 shifts now, and I'd like to bring that together a little bit to thinking about why Americans then chose Trump. So you can have the next slide, please. So I think that, I hope that you understand that American foreign policy has shifted, and indeed the question that I posed to you at the beginning, whether Trump is a symptom or a cause, is complex. And perhaps it is more accurate to say that he's both a symptom and a cause. Now, but I want to think about the domestic perspective here. Why did Americans choose Trump? And to answer these questions, it's why you have here an article that I wrote here. I want to share some research that I did in 2017 on political insurgencies. And I looked at the political insurgency of George McGovern, an American president, or American candidate, I should say, for presidency, and the impact that George McGovern's insurgency had on American foreign policy. And I found that McGovern's insurgency was an important historical event that was accompanied by social unrest, distrust in government, the splintering of the Democratic Party into disparate foreign policy groups, including the neoconservatives, of who some of you may have heard of before, who who the neoconservatives would leave the Democratic Party in the 1970s, and by the 1980s find a new home in the Republican Party during the Reagan years. Now, I don't want to go too much in this research, and I think it'd be lovely if you all then in the future were interested in it now. But what I want to point out that unexpectedly, while I was thinking about the environmental conditions of McGovern's insurgency in the 1970s during the Vietnam War era, I saw suddenly parallels between the insurgency that tore the Democratic Party apart to what was taking place in the Republican Party in the lead up to 2016. I knew how insurgency affected foreign policy then, and I had some speculations or comparable scenarios how I thought it would affect how it would be playing out in 2016. So, but my belief was that no matter who won in 2016, American presidential election, the presidential election would be defined by the rejection of establishment candidates and the electorate's embrace of insurgents who openly waged war on their own parties. And certainly Trump secured the Republican nomination by disagreeing with his party's mainstream members on many core issues. So next slide, please. We also know the Democratic Party had its own insurgent, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. There he is. He didn't win the primary competition, but whose popularity, just like Trump's, emerged from disagreeing with the traditional Democratic Party on key policy issues. Both Trump and Sanders tapped into the deep discomfort felt by a sizable segment of the American electorate, a part that felt a loss of its national identity, a part of America that experienced a crisis of confidence in government and leadership, a part of America who experienced a physical insecurity driven by international terrorism and a fear of crime and drugs that plagued decaying urban and rural communities. And I have another slide that I think is illustrative of this. The next slide, please. Now, I think this is a slide from about 2020, so the election that we just had. And I think this slide is very illustrative of the part of America that felt real economic decline. This slide, I think, is very telling. There are 2,400 counties, so the smaller voting districts of America, that voted for Trump. And these 2,400 counties are clearly much poorer than the less than 500 counties that voted for Biden. In fact, I think this slide tells you more about the Trump voter than any other information out there. As James Carville said during the Clinton campaign, it's the economy, stupid. People in these 2,400, you see they're very small. If you look at this slide,
interesting.
People in these 2,400 counties experience a crisis of confidence in government and leadership. They felt left behind. They certainly did not and do not benefit from the wealth that's currently being generated on Wall Street or through the process of globalization and its emphasis on comparative advantage. These people don't have a comparative advantage, and they have economic pain. I think this is very telling. So the people who voted for Trump in 2016, you definitely could include those red counties, and they definitely are still there in 2020. So let's move on to the next slide, please. In 2016, as we saw again in 2020, the last slide, Trump won the primary race and secured the Republican nomination by being insurgent, by opposing Republican Party professionals, in particular foreign policy professionals, over such topics as whether free trade is beneficial for the American economy, whether the U.S. should adopt a more isolationist stance, and whether the U.S. should accept more migrants. There were 122 Republican foreign policy experts who signed 2 different Never Trump letters before the election. So I hope that gives you some idea about why people chose the insurgent. Let's go to the next one, and I want to think more about what sort of impact, the next slide, please, what sort of impact Trump had on U.S. foreign policy. So what has it meant now that we see that the insurgent is in, or was in now, or about to leave the White House? What has it meant for the U.S.? What has it meant for the EU, for the Netherlands, and the world? Well, I could say that regrettably, the first few tumultuous months of the Trump policymaking machine set the norm for conduct. Moreover, the administration continued to lose competent staff who were replaced by loyalists or persons who did not have relevant government experience. Those individuals who European leaders hoped would establish a more standard foreign policy, people like Secretary of Defense James Mattis, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster, all of these adults, so-called adults in the room, they all left by January 2019. Their replacements were chosen for allegiance to Trump over competency. Thus, we can say by midway of Trump's term, the so-called adults had not achieved their preferred policy of preserving and strengthening the U.S. alliance system. Trump's strategy of regularly undermining his own officials meant that U.S. policy suffered from a credibility gap between the stated plan and what the president said and did, and America's trustworthiness greatly declined. For example, Gallup ratings showed that U.S. leadership dropped 40 points, or confidence in U.S. leadership dropped by 40 points in places like Portugal, Belgium, Norway, and Canada. So places you would normally think had a lot of confidence in America no longer did. Next slide, please. Oops, there we go. By the fourth year of his term, Trump's bullying tactics took on added vim when he announced the withdrawal of roughly 12,000 U.S. troops stationed in Germany. The fact that some of the soldiers were moved next door to Belgium, along with their command, made clear that the withdrawal was to punish Germany, and Merkel in particular, for its underinvestment in defense and its perceived unfair trade practices, and certainly its trade deficit with the United States, which of course Trump very much focuses on trade deficits. So let's go on to the next one. So I hope you have some idea about what it's like under Trump, but now he lost, now what? Well, whether the world likes it or not, some aspects of Trumpism are here to stay. Biden's win does mean that some internationalism will return, but Biden has to consider the fact that the U.S. began retreating from its global leadership role while he was vice president. Although at the Munich Security Conference, and here you see him sitting at the Munich Security Conference in February 2019, Biden articulated the idea that his presidency would return to internationalism. The truth is that the U.S. had already grown weary and inward-looking as it tired of fighting endless wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Moreover, we know America had already begun to diminish its support of the international system. I told you that in the beginning of my presentation. And this certainly happened before Trump entered the White House. We also know that Trump's capturing the presidency as an insurgent in 2016 is symptomatic of a general revision in thinking about U.S. global leadership and its role in global institutions. So add to these things what we know already, that the Democratic Party itself is shifting towards a more Trumpian view of the world. The other two Democratic candidates that voiced views on foreign policy during the campaign, namely Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, both see Trump not as a historical aberration. That's what Biden called Trump, that he's an aberration. And funny enough, interesting enough, so do people like John Bolton, who was, of course, the controversial super hawk that was Trump's third national security advisor. John Bolton agrees with Biden on this and calling Trump an aberration, but not Elizabeth Warren and not Bernie Sanders. They think that what Trump has done, or some sort of restraining of U.S. foreign policy, is part of a long historical decline in the U.S.'s role on the world stage. And in fact, there are some new strategic thinkers in the Democratic Party named the restrainers. These new voices advocate, as you might imagine, restraint, something that if Hillary Clinton had won, she certainly would find deplorable. But this label restrainers, I heard, was used recently in two workshops that I attended this fall. One of them was on the future efficacy of nuclear weapons, and one was on the future of transatlantic relations. And both in these places, I heard leaders or people talking about the concept of restraint. So this concept of restraint is becoming much more mainstream. So that's what Biden will have to work with. So what if we were to think about, though, an agenda of Joe Biden, what would we have? Well, there are a number of more traditional security challenges that President-elect Biden must address. Things like a new nuclear arms race, nuclear proliferation in places like Iran, emerging threats from cyber warfare, conventional weapons being controlled by artificial intelligence, new hypersonic weapons that I mentioned before. North Korea also remains a threat that Trump's summit diplomacy did nothing to allay. But I think that all these things, while they are more traditional security threats, and they'll still be on his agenda, the most important issue for a newly elected President Biden will be, and could we have the next slide? The COVID-19 pandemic. And unfortunately, the absence of any U.S. leadership to combat the virus during Trump's term in office, this created opportunities for nationalism, including an international blame game. You had fights over personal protective equipment, fights over exclusive access to vaccines. Maybe that'll be better now that we have 3 different ones that are emerging on the stage now. But in past epidemics, the U.S. played a unifying role, one that utilized relevant international organizations, such as the G7, the World Health Organization. And although we know that a return to internationalism will not be easy, Biden's administration could go some way in addressing the devastating human costs of the pandemic by not shirking from global responsibilities, as Trump has done, and not spurning relevant international organizations. Trump's prior stance could, we could say, even create opportunities for Biden to push for reform in places like the WHO, which could use some reform. Biden could then focus on pandemic preparedness by following science and listening to experts. This means that the U.S. could set a good example by investing in medical workers and emergency equipment, increasing its funding for places like the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and also the National Institute of Health in the U.S. And these are, of course, domestic, but then you also have internationally the WHO. So I think that will be definitely his first agenda item. Second, the next slide, please. The second most important issue for Biden's presidency is linked to this first one. The economic damage wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic to the global economy will be worse than the Great Depression of the 1930s. The US jobless rate in the wake of the pandemic essentially wiped out all the job gains that could be increasing in the meantime, but the job gains they had since the last recession, which took place in 2008, when Barack Obama started his first term. But therein lies one advantage that President Biden has in addressing the severely weakened global economy, because as Obama's vice president, Biden has some experience in dealing with this deep downturn of the US and a deep downturn in the global economy. In fact, Biden was personally responsible for administering the $787 billion stimulus that Obama launched to combat the deepening recession in 2008. And I think that when you're talking about global economy, experience counts, because solutions will need to be complex and innovative, or the problem is complex and solutions must be innovative. The most vulnerable countries in the global system will need support. The US could be a leader in reanimating elements of the liberal world order, such as the International Monetary Fund, that could go some way in finding global solutions, and the US retains a potentially powerful economy that could influence it that way. I must also say that I'm personally excited by the economic team that Biden just recently announced. Maybe you heard about that, because there's a heavy emphasis on women with backgrounds that focus on addressing longstanding inequalities. Of course, we know that he has Janet Yellen as the first female Treasury Secretary, and then we also have 2 other women for the council, the chair on Council on Economic Advisors, and the White House Office of Management and Budget. So I think having some women there in charge might be a good thing. It's my personal opinion. Okay, let's go on to the third. The third point, the next slide, please. So focusing on climate change, along with the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is agreement with Iran, I think those two things were some of Obama's, we could put those on his accomplishment list. And there are a couple examples of this. So Biden could, in this case, build from the Obama administration's successes. He could start by redirecting climate policy towards a new set of multilateral agreements, repairing relations with international institutions that combat global warming. Additionally, of course, he has to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. The fact that John Kerry has been tapped for this newly created post, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, which is also based on the National Security Council, this is a very welcome development, I think, for climate, and a very much welcome element in this agenda item. Kerry helped negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement, but he could face some skepticism when he seeks to reassert U.S. leadership in this regard. He has to regain the trust of other countries for for more aggressive climate action. Domestically, Biden should invest in renewables and energy efficiency. Add to this that no matter who, whoever is in charge of the climate, whether it's Kerry or other people, the American public needs to understand that the global economy and the U.S. economy will face shocks on par with COVID-19 if we don't do something about climate. In fact, under the Trump executive, Trump's executive branch in 2018 did a study that said without rapid reductions in greenhouse gases, the warming of the Earth's temperature will kill annually thousands of America. And I think this is what this slide illustrates here from the Brookings Institution, that mortality rates in these different parts of America will go up because related to climate. Of course, there's other costs too. Here you see coastal damage, labor, agricultural yields, those sorts of things. So I think it's important that Biden communicate that to the American public. All right, next agenda point that he will need to address. Now, these first three issues that I have been talking about this evening are global problems. They're going to require international cooperation. They necessitate global teamwork that a new U.S. administration could lead and could be to coax other nations into the right direction. But now this fourth issue that I have here relates to the deep structural shifts that are reshaping global politics. China's rise in the global pecking order and its emphasis on sovereignty contributes to a back to the future realpolitik world that I spoke about earlier and that Biden cannot ignore. As China seeks to translate its economic rise to political power, it challenges the structure of the post-war system as well as the Western values and institutions that underpin this system. And in the wake of the U.S.'s slow and poor response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Trump administration's clear unwillingness to organize an international effort to fight the disease, as it hasn't had in past epidemics, China saw opportunities for itself to burnish its soft power, to burnish its image, to be a world leader. So it does not help that the trade war with China did not alter any of the institutional practices that it was meant to stop. But at the same time, Trump's executive orders, which demand American firms unwind their commercial relations with some of the places like ByteDance, Chat, these could lead to the losses in the trillions for global technology firms. And also, certainly, the trade war also has led to the loss of American jobs. So we could say that Trump's trade policies, from a financial point of view, are not working. They're costly to America and global economies. Thus, when Biden comes into the White House, he's going to have, on the one hand, a confident China that feels burnished soft power, believes the pandemic and the resulting global recession are marking a geopolitical reordering, that China is rising. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, Biden will encounter a fearful China that may see retaliatory measures such as selling its treasury bonds, which amount to $1.1 trillion worth of treasury bonds. They might see this as a viable option in its economic war with the US. So how does Biden respond to China? Well, he could respond to this combination of swagger and fear by emphasizing that from a number of perspectives, China's global structures are not as desirable as the US's. In an age when we have a virus that can stall economies, overwhelm excellent healthcare, kill tens of thousands of citizens, Biden could be forthright in pointing out that its allies, America's allies, should not depend on an autocratic China. Biden could also use a little bit of what Trump did as leverage. Trump's sanctions, Trump trade war with China, these things have created some leverage for Biden. Biden should not dispense with sanctions and lessen the trade war in a hurry without getting something substantial in return from China. So, next slide. So, Russia's reemergence as a player of consequence on the international stage coincides with Putin's adventurism in Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014 that I mentioned earlier. A revanchist Russia that further decided to support Bashar al-Assad in Syria. This also further strained US-Russia relations. Obama then sort of resorted to the path of least resistance. To add to this, that after Trump's withdrawal of forces from Iraq and Syria, Putin emerged as the kingpin in the Middle East, and you get another agenda item for President Biden, and that is how to deal with an assertive Russia. So the first step in Biden's reset, I think, would be to extend the New START treaty. This was brokered by Obama, and this treaty limits U.S. and Russian strategic long-range nuclear arsenals. Without extending New START, it could go the way of the INF Treaty, which was the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, and it could collapse. There doesn't seem to be any cheating involved in the New START, but if you don't re-ratify it, it could be, if you don't make sure that it's continued, it could open the way for a new nuclear arms race. The second step in dealing with Russia that Biden could take is rebuild transatlantic ties in order to present a unified front to Russia. Putin is surely delighted that America's relations with its European allies, in particular with Germany, is at a low. Trump's transactional view of alliances created division between allies that Putin could have only fantasized about before January 2017. So those are the agenda items. Maybe we could go to the next slide. How are we doing on time? Good, we're nearing the end.
Yeah, all good.
2021. I want to look at what changes and what stays the same. So the electoral environment of November 2020 was partly different and partly the same as in November 2016. 4 years ago, the American electorate embraced candidates who openly waged war on their parties. That's what I told you, right? Today, America is again, or perhaps still, expressing political cynicism and anti-establishment fervor. However, current anti-establishment passion is partly the result of a renewed sense of urgency in the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of George Floyd's death and the economic, cultural, and social effects of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. These factors seem to create an environment that is ripe for conspiracy theories. The poster that I have here, this was on my Facebook page, posted by friends of mine when they wrote all these positive comments about it. And I find it rather fantastic, this conspiracy poster, because of its all-encompassing nature.
Very much.
conspiracy you can imagine is rolled up into this one poster. Everyone, including the Queen, all the way back to, it's just it's very all-encompassing. So you can see that the environment that we're in today is really one that seems to support conspiracy theories being created. In 2016, agitations meant America embraced Trump and Sanders, but not Hillary Clinton, the traditional candidate picked by Democratic Party professionals. Now, Joe Biden is as a traditional candidate, president-elect as they come. Therefore, he may have difficulties in connecting with the anti-establishment mood that currently pervades much of America. Moreover, I'm sorry, Trump will likely remain in the political spotlight and continue to affect US politics in a way that is perilous for it and the future of the Republican Party. As I said earlier, more than 74 million Americans voted for Trump, which is an unprecedented number. More than voted for him in 2016, when he received 63 million votes. So we're talking about 10 more million voting for Trump in 2020 than did in 2016. Trump is like a rock star with 74 million groupies. Republicans will want to find a balance between keeping these groupies, these voters, motivated to support the party in the future, but at the same time, reel in Trump's incendiary rhetoric and race baiting. So I recently read that public opinion in Europe about America since COVID-19 is in rapid decline. Respect for the US is draining from the continent. Pundits are resurrecting Robert Kagan's thesis that the Americans are from Mars and the Europeans are from Venus, which dates to differences in 2003 at the start of the Iraq War during the George W. Bush administration. What does all this mean? I can feel a perceptible loss of US soft power, that Europeans find America less attractive today. At the same time, I was also aware that Europeans were avidly watching this election, willing the American democratic system to protect itself. Joe Biden's victory may not be what many hope for and may all too soon produce disappointment and constrained policy. Still, the fact that we have a 46th president of the United States is a very good outcome for the 2020 elections. Thank you. And you go to the next slide.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you see, you actually touched upon one thing that had been going through my mind the whole time about, where does this leave the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party, when you see how many people really voted for Trump? Yeah, do they really try to pull away from it, or how do they keep those voters, but also maybe try to win next time as well? It must be very conflicting theories going on there.
I think the key is that slide I showed you on the counties.
Yeah, that was very interesting, that slide, actually.
Trump certainly, we can go all the questions too. I mean, Trump certainly was good at invigorating a part of the American electorate that felt left out. And I think what Biden needs to do and what the Democratic Party needs to do is they need to go into those places. I mean, I'm from one of those counties in the red. When I go home, I see that there is this perceptible decline from the whole of the area where I grew up, what it is now. Fewer people, houses are very much in decline. So you can definitely see that there is a part of America that feels left out and feels left behind. And I don't think the solution is changing the Electoral College to balance out those part of the more populous areas or the richer areas. No, they already obviously have a lot of clout. And now they actually have won the Electoral College. They need to find something to reinvigorate those parts of America that are suffering.
Yeah, definitely. It's about, not just thinking, this is what we've done in the past and, we need to make sure we continue this, but how do we actually, because a lot of the coal mining communities, I remember when Barack Obama was going for presidency, a lot of the coal mining communities were really worried about the energy, the way things were going. And it's like, well, it's not so much about moving away from there, but also, maybe retraining and, as you said, reinvigorating and changing the way that these communities are used and what they're used to. But that's a big task, I have to say.
I mean, presidents, even Democratic presidents in the past, like Clinton with NAFTA, they said it's true. There was a lot of wealth that was the result of trade, of globalization and trade deals. But then there were and wealth may have indeed benefited the majority of the people, but the pain was very concentrated. And the money that they did, they had promises. You talked about retraining. They had promises that they would come in and invest with the money that was gained elsewhere, but those kinds of things were often forgotten. And then you have concentrated pain, and maybe wealth being in the urban areas, but you needed to find ways of making sure that people that were left behind were not in this whole move for globalization, in wealth creation, in economies of scale, or in comparative advantage. All these things you also need then to figure out. I mean, capitalism is very good at wealth generation, but then they need to find ways of also, and maybe this new team, because there's so many of this team with Janet Yellen in particular, who have spent a lifetime in studying the economies of inequalities and how to best rectify those inequalities. So you said you had questions?
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions. Guillaume, do you want to read some of those out? Audience, please do feel free to ask any more.
Yeah, so David sends a question regarding the restrainers versus retainers, and what does it say with the appointment of Michel Flournoy, if I say that correctly, as Secretary of Defense?
Has she been? If she's been, I know she was announced, but if she's been announced, it must have been very recently, because I didn't hear that. It must have been today. Is that true? Has she been appointed as Secretary of Defense today?
I'm not sure.
I would have to do a quick Google search, but it's not something I'm aware of. But if she has been announced, then what would you say?
I think Michel Flournoy indeed doesn't fall within the restrainers. I think, well, I don't know about you mean the U.S. retaining its position? It might very well be. There are certainly, if you look at the national security team that Biden has put together, there are indeed a lot of liberal hawks there. It could very well be that, and certainly Biden himself is a reflexive internationalist. We'll see. But although, having said that, when he was vice president, there was also a decline in internationalism, and maybe we'll have the aberration. I don't know. I would still like it to. I definitely am a proponent of internationalism. So.
David made a comment. He did say possible. Yeah. So it's.
I think it is right. Yeah.
Well, I, for one, would like Michel Flournoy to be the first female Secretary of Defense. I'm rooting for her.
Yep. And we have another question from Wandering Spacium. So, talking about what is the lasting impact of Trump's populist stance in other countries, and what are the populist leaders? Are they here to stay? Is this something that we're really going to see? I guess going back to what I said with how do parties keep these 73 million votes without maybe being a Trumpism kind of party, but also here in Europe.
Well, I think populism and nativism and tribalism and polarization in general, all these things are a part of the trends that we see taking place since the 1980s and 1990s. And I think it has to go back with how economies have been run. I mean, even today we have very low interest rates, right? But that's good for people who already have some sort of assets and then can go out and get a low mortgage, or can go out and buy a car without paying very much. I mean, people who already have wealth can benefit the fact that you have some low interest rates. But it's very hard for many people around the world who don't have very much to think populism has a source, and that source is, I think, people's economic pain. And I'm hoping that indeed the current change in economic team will make a difference in that. And but we'll see. And I think also climate change is also making all those things more difficult, because climate change is also affecting those areas where people don't have recourse to get to higher ground, or don't have recourse to change the fact that there isn't any rainfall.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
climate change is making things worse.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, that's really great. So if the audience has any more questions, now is the time to put them in as we're wrapping up. So one thing I did want to brush upon as well, when you were talking about the things that Biden has to do, the first couple of things you mentioned, it to me straight away, I thought, oh, this sounds really hopeful. There are all these actually really amazing things that he can focus on to make his, presidency legacy quite a great one. And kind of, and it's funny when you think about someone like Trump coming in after Obama, who also was thought of as doing quite a few good things, and then he's changed course quite a way. How do these presidents, do they really look at the pitfalls of the president beforehand to think, okay, how do I make my president's legacy kind of something to stand for? Or is it,
well,
how are these kind of driven?
A presidential system is much more difficult to pass sweeping legislation.
Yes,
that has to do with the balance of powers and the power that the legislature has. I mean, in parliamentary systems, if you command the majority in parliament, you should be able to pass things. But in the presidential system, often, as is the case, I mean, Obama had 2 years of Democratic majority in the legislature and holding the presidency, and then he lost that in that first midterm election. Biden he will definitely have a House on his side. We don't know about the Senate because we have a runoff election in Georgia, which of course is why things are still very fraught, and why the Republicans haven't seemed to stop campaigning, because they still want to capture the Senate and capture those 2 runoff election seats in Georgia. Now, if it would miraculously go Biden's way and he had the legislature, then he could think about passing more legislation. But I think the reality is that there probably will be more paralysis, more gridlock, just like Obama experienced. Mitch McConnell is still there. He's still the Senate Majority Leader. Even if they were to get 1 or 2 of the senators in Georgia, it still would be a very tiny majority. So it would be, I think it's we should not expect, although Biden may be more able to negotiate with the other side than Obama was. Obama wasn't always very good at bipartisanship, and maybe because Biden has such a long history in the Senate, he will be better at that. But we should not expect miracles.
Yep.
We should
hopeful,
have low hopes going in, and then we can be we can feel very good about anything that is achieved. That's my advice, Russ. Not to have great expectations, but to have low expectations.
It's kind of how the elections went and how Europeans felt about it. Just hoping for something great, but we got something, and we're thankful for that. I feel well.
And the Europeans,
but yeah, of course,
should really think more about indeed their own security and defense and how they will finance that or how they will invest in that. And they should really start thinking about how they convince their publics that this is something that is valuable for them, that terrorism is not going to go away, that migrants are also going to be a problem, that those security issues, that the European Union also has a role to play in that. And then as far as defense, you have to think about, when you still do have, the UK will still be part of NATO, so you still do have 2 countries that have nuclear weapons within. But unfortunately, we all would love, I would love nuclear weapons to not exist, but they do exist. Iran is now further along since Trump destroyed the JCPOA or left the JCPOA. So Iran is further along as a nuclear power. North Korea is definitely a nuclear power. So we are not going to get rid of nuclear powers anytime soon. And so if Europe wants to have this defense that it would need, it needs to have some sort of nuclear defense if it ever wants to have its own defense. And of course, the UK would be an integral part of that. But I think the point that I want to make there is that it doesn't have to be presented to publics in such a way that they only hear, oh, we're spending money on guns and not healthcare. It can be presented in a way or done in a way that is good for the economy, that's good for research. I mean, there are lots of things like GPS and microwaves and all kinds of things that were developed through our military use that have another use that we all depend on today. So it could be that you are developing things in for scientists that have very good uses for society, but then also are very good for your own security and defense. So it can be things like artificial intelligence or cyber something. They could be trying to be innovative about thinking about how to invest in your security and defense, and thinking also about the threats for tomorrow.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'd like to say thank you very, very much, Roberta. We'll have to wrap up now as we've come up to time. It was a very interesting talk, and I think a great way to end these Pint of Science House Netherlands events that we've had. So thank you so much to the audience as well. You've been really great over the past couple of months to keep this event going in the way that we were able to this year. So we wish you all a very happy holidays and break, whatever you're able to do. And we will see how we are able to return next year, whether it will be we'll do some more online events, or we're able to do hybrid situations, and we'll just we will keep you updated. So please keep an eye on the Facebook page and all of our other streams and social medias to we can let you know what we're up to. So I guess I'm out, but maybe we can just do one last cheers to say goodnight.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
See you next year.